Part 4. The Red Kingdom. The Kingdom of the Spirit. Chapter 31. Recruiting the Spiritual Army and Rediscovering the Spiritual Paths. One moment, we were horses running wild across the land. The next, we were eagles flying in the sky. But when we approached the onset of the Red Spiritual Kingdom, there was a great war, and all that was left to imagine was to take a human form and embody the truth that we are. 2 horns had grown high on my head, and with each step closer, the battle seemed to peak. Yet no one came near us, and so a path spread through this great spiritual sea. Upon approaching the Red Kingdom, I didn't knock, but rather I envisioned myself as a serpent and snuck right in. Then when I got behind the gate, I thought of myself just as I was, and so I reclaimed the form of that horned being, half creature, half human. The spiritual guards were a bit surprised, but once I was past the spiritual gate, I ventured all the way up, high to the king-sealed courtyard towering over the land, and this time I knocked. When the door opened, everyone was in shock, and to my surprise, the cruel king was sick and lying upon a hospital bed. I'd been gone long enough, and now the old king was nearly dead. "Come here," whispered the dying king. "You have been faithful when I was cruel. Forgive me, noble warrior, for I regret what I have put you through. I have grown old, and there is no other kingdom to which our people can run. The world is at war, and something must be done. There is a dragon named Satan, and he is trying to conquer all the realms. You must rise up and stop him. Otherwise, the kingdoms of the body, the mind, and the spirit will all be overwhelmed." This old king escaped from kingdom to kingdom, all while Satan's army brought forth disaster and misfortune. Then I saw the lover from my inner garden. There she was, the Golden Maiden. "Has the wedding happened?" She ran to me.
"There's 1 day left. Propose now, and I will accept it,"
said the Golden Maiden. "But you must overcome the dragon. If the dragon is not caged, the wars will continue to rage, and Satan will not have learned his lesson. Once you cage that dragon, then you will have my blessing," said the old king. "Then if I do this and come back, I'll have your daughter's hand in marriage," I asked the king. "Do this, and then I can rest in comfort and peace. And after you complete this, the kingdom will be yours. Cage the dragon, and the armies will cease. Then you will have the Golden Maiden as your reward," said the king. And so I was led before the king, to an iron box that concealed the flaming sword. "This belongs to you, for it is yours," said the old king. Upon this reunion, I took up the sword to fulfill another task, and so I would go out and journey to find Satan, who was leading the wars and attacks. The Golden Maiden stayed up high, since it seemed to be one of the few places that were safe. And as I walked away to figure out what I must do now, I could hear the whispers from the spiritual crowd that escaped. They had seen who I was with the horns, as I'd exposed my truest nature, and now I held a unique purpose in helping the spiritual kingdom flourish. And so I wondered, must we sacrifice our character, our wishes, and our personal desires in order to help the planet and free the Golden Maiden? Now when it comes to time in the divine kingdom, time moves much slower than a day upon the earth. For instance, a day in divine time might be 4, 5, or 6 years upon the earth. The Golden Maiden said we had 1 day left, which could have been many human days or years. But this Red Kingdom was quite unique, because just when I thought all this chaos was at the worst, it always seemed to find a new peak. Of course we were in a rush, but I was also guided by forces beyond my body and mind, and so I let go of control when I surrendered to this kingdom of the divine. As I went off in search of Satan, I realized that many people, plants, and creatures were in need. and so I walked among many paths, trying to clear the way so that these helpless souls could be led to the spiritual kingdom where they would be set free. That's when I realized I couldn't do this alone, and so I would need help. I would need to find other kingdoms and look for those who were fighting the wickedness beyond just myself. Why, this path was about assisting our entire world, so this was not just about me, but rather I realized that the onset of all this chaos would require us to come together and form a spiritual army. Understand that the first two kingdoms I'd gone through, I'd managed to find my way without much outside help. That was my personal journey into the dark descent, where I was alone with no one else. As I found the way, it took me to the bottom of the earth and through the underworld, all because I set off to answer a call and honor the Golden Maiden who was in sync with the entire earth. So how does one form a spiritual army when there is so much chaos clouding the body and mind? I decided that while everyone was preoccupied, I would need to look for pathways between the kingdoms that led to the realm of the spirit, which could be difficult to find. Ever since I entered the kingdom of the spirit, it seemed people had taken awareness of me and these horns. There I discovered a certain psychic energy that lingered and spread out without a warning. For instance, those who were connected to the body, mind, and into the third spiritual kingdom had connections to the spiritual powers, and so without words, they were able to send telepathic messages out from this great spiritual tower. Many people who solely lived in the body or the mind may not have received these messages, since it came from the realm of spirit. Sometimes people might get a glimpse of an awakening, but for those stuck in the body or the mind, even if they heard a message from such a great being, they may come to fear it. In order to refine my spiritual capabilities, I was led into yoga teacher training, and so my intuition directed me into many unique settings. Meanwhile, there was a war in the world, and the old king said we needed to cage Satan, and it seemed that no one else was willing to accept such a duty in the entire spiritual kingdom. Now the irony is that if Satan kept destroying the earth, even the spiritual kingdom could be lost. Meanwhile, all these spiritual beings seemed content in their place, even though the kingdoms of the mortal body and mental mind were spinning in chaos and mostly lost. Now, in order to summon a spiritual army, we couldn't simply print a poster with words, and so I started by keeping quiet, moving from situation to situation where I would humbly observe. I soon became aware of psychic intuition and intelligence, and so I was aware of many great and powerful spiritual beings. I gained much wisdom by focusing my awareness upon many great teachers' unique stories. This awareness allowed my mind to realize that beyond the spiritual kingdom were various kingdoms all over the galaxy and Earth. In essence, there were pathways that led from the body and mind into the realm of the spiritual birth. The first big shift came through yoga training, which led me to study the Eastern scriptures, where I found the wisdom of the sages. And so I logged onto a virtual screen where I would quietly observe and listen to the masters as they studied ancient texts and pages. Their kingdom was connected to the great spiritual kingdom, and their kingdom was called the kingdom of Krishna and Bhakti. The pathway between their kingdom and the divine kingdom was neatly kept and maintained properly. It might be difficult to find this path if you were only interested in the body or mind, but through yoga training, you would have an idea about Bhakti and the Krishna kingdom and how it's a pathway into the divine. If only to test out my new spiritual knowledge, I walked from the red spiritual kingdom into the kingdom of Bhakti, and within an instant, it seemed that they had come to notice me. As soon as they caught on to me, it felt like word began to spread. Why, in the kingdom of the spirit, we were passing psychic energy without words, rather than in-person meetings, and we spoke through the thoughts in our heads. The sages brought their teacher on a virtual call, and I remember something clicked. As if a divine auspicious coincidence brought resources and great beings together. A spiritual leadership had come and found me in ways the kingdom of the body and mind could not quite depict. Of course, they seemed excited for me to follow their teachings and stay, but the Golden Maiden's old king had assigned me with a serious task. Even though I knew that Bhakti was the truth, I had to turn around and go back. In order to cage Satan and to unite the kingdoms of the body and mind with the kingdom of the spirit, I would have to walk many paths in consecutive fashion, even though this took a personal risk. The next pathway I found was with a Buddhist group, and again this path was well maintained as we studied the sacred path of the warrior. I remember when I arrived, I got a psychic tag, as if they placed an ear tag on me from afar while I roamed in this new frontier. With this path, I was led into the kingdom of Shambala, but to my surprise, many of the students had grown much older, and the pathway to this kingdom of Shambala was still present, but there was a little brush and wilderness intruding from the path's shoulders. In essence, there would need to be a transfer of wisdom, otherwise the great teachings were in jeopardy of being lost. I continued to tune into them and learn on virtual calls, and sometimes I would zone out and think about books or secret libraries. Then when my awareness would come back to the screen, there the person managing the meeting would change the background to the daydream I had where I pictured the library. They were teaching me without words, showing me that they could tune into the thoughts of my head. At first this can drive you a bit crazy, but I simply surrendered since I felt as if I had once been dead. I felt a connection and pull to each path, but over and over I had to go back. Each time I walked from the kingdom of Bhakti or the kingdom of Shambhala to the kingdom of spirit, I would do my best to clear and maintain the path. While many of the students, sages, and teachers were content on staying in the kingdom of their teachings, I knew that the material world was at risk of falling apart. In order to help others, I felt it was a duty to clear many pathways, including the pathway into my own heart. Soon I found another unique spiritual group. This was called the Kingdom of Neem Karoli Baba. He was a great saint from India, and he wore a plaid blanket, as he was a miracle Baba. This path had many students, one of which was Ram Das, and so they resided in the kingdom of the plaid blanket. And this pathway was clear and well maintained, but there was a certain awareness that many of the original students could someday leave our human planet. The more I went back and forth on these unique spiritual paths, the more I began to sense a feeling of concern. They were all aware that the world was in danger, but these groups and kingdoms were also content in staying where they were. I, on the other hand, seemed to have a unique set of features. I could use my mind to shift rapidly, and so I could become an eagle, a buffalo, a horse, or a half-man, half-horned creature. This allowed me to move at a rapid rate, and so I could traverse many paths, to clear any overgrown brush rather quick. I found that I was a unique vehicle that departed from each kingdom to clear a way back to the realm of the spirit. From one strange occurrence to another, the spirit would use my body, mind, and soul to send out signals to the remote groups. And so this fostered the cultivation of a spiritual army where each kingdom of Bhakti, Shambhala, and the plaid blanket began to come together as they were all aware of the soulful scoop. Since my spiritual form was always changing, I could barely remember if I alone was just one form. Depending on the situation and what was required, my entire persona and being would shift and transform. Whatever I was called for, I would trust and adapt, and so I learned that I was willing to make a total fool of myself if it meant that it would support the world who was under attack. Maybe the most difficult part was when I journeyed into the kingdom of Bhakti, Shambhala, or the plaid blanket, because my soul felt a deep urge to stay, but I also felt pulled to the Golden Maiden, and because we were in divine time, I knew that the world of the body and mind needed support, since we were upon the final spiritual day. I would tune in while many great sages would reveal teachings and stories. But the teachers and teachings began to blur. It was as if they wanted me to join their group alone, and this was a bit heartbreaking, because every time I was with them, I felt at home. I was called to go back and forth, over and over again. I would keep clearing the pathways and recording what I found in various stories so that we could lead others from the body and mind into the spiritual kingdom. The best way I can describe this is that in the kingdom of the spirit, the great beings operate out of a higher will, driven not by ego, but rather they obey and listen to an intuitive wisdom that is supported by all the scriptures which have been instilled. This can be uncomfortable to get used to, because it would drive my personal ego crazy. Often it was so overwhelming that I would shut down and my body and mind would get lazy. Since I had to venture into the lower realms, I would leave the higher space of spirit and enter back into the body and mind. This journey seemed to squeeze my psyche and spirit, but still I would venture into the unknown, lower realms to discover new paths that I was meant to find. This may have caused confusion for the kingdom of Bhakti, the kingdom of Shambala, and the kingdom of the plaid blanket, and I wondered if they were disgruntled that I wouldn't retain my spiritual purity, and so I felt my rapid transformations were actually making some of them feel a bit angry. And so they would guide me. They would send signals, messages, or flying arrows. They would shoot them near the path I was on. Their intent was to lead me forward whenever I would forget the way back. Imagine this like finding a safe haven in religion or spirituality, only to be called to venture out for days, weeks, or months to explore. I would go off into the unknown, all in an effort to reveal the path back to others. Of course, I knew where home was, but along the journey, I'd get tired, sad, and lonely, for they seemed happy and healthy in the kingdoms. But the more I traveled extensively, the more I grew weary. Again and again, the great kingdoms would send signs, trying to guide me back to the spiritual kingdom. But I was relentless in my search to go deeper into the outskirts of the mind and body. In my own heart, I wanted to stay where it was kind and cozy. I dreamt of living in an ashram, moving to India, or working full-time in a yoga studio. Instead, I felt I had a unique calling, and so I would record my adventures to document the pathways I discovered, while weaving this knowledge into stories. I would share these lessons in the kingdoms of the body and mind on a podcast, and I would call them allegories. To many people in the world, I'm sure they thought I lost my mind, but I was very focused about revealing the pathways home to the spirit through the body and mind into the divine. Now, I was not a professional in this spiritual landscape, and so my mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual states would shift very fast. One day I'd be on cloud 9, then the next, it seemed like the clouds of depression wouldn't pass. When I'd come home to the kingdom of spirit, I'd get a glimpse of the Golden Maiden, but then I'd be sent out on another path-clearing mission. I'd take my book of stories and write while journeying day and night, and when a book was completed, I would record it and release an oral transmission. This became quite difficult, because I would leave my stories on the side of the road, and I rarely heard anyone say thank you. Rather, all I seemed to receive were the critics condemning any words I missed, and this was the heaviest burden that an artist can go through. I tried, and I would not lie. I gave the truth my most sincere effort, and so many nights I wondered if these journeys would cause my body and mind to die. Again, I was aware of the paths into the kingdom of Bhakti, Shambala, and the plaid blanket, but I knew I had to fulfill the request of the old king. Otherwise, the world's terror would increase, and so would Satan's destruction. The more I traveled, the more I learned that certain people would blame me. But I wasn't responsible for the chaos. It was a collection of the entire world's tragedies. Since I would change so fast, I felt very sensitive to the psychic criticism and blame. Sometimes, it felt like groups would condemn me for going back into the body and mind, and not staying in the spiritual kingdom. But what was I to do? when I had gotten wind of a spiritual need that no one else was willing to do. And so instead of pausing for ease and comfort, I dug deeper and continued to push through. The deeper I went, the more paths I would clear, and so I'd go from the spiritual kingdom and resurrect any old pathways into the body and the mind sphere. Every so often, a soul would notice, and I'd wave to them and say, "Yes, this is the way." They might look at me, but they always seemed to think I was so strange. It takes a mysterious creature to rediscover and clear spiritual paths quickly. Otherwise, it might take ages for the teachers and students to move from the body and mind to clear these paths. And so I knew that even though my energy was often sporadic, I was determined to help and serve by moving extremely fast. Every so often, as I journey out into the body or mind, I would find a glimpse of the Golden Maiden. I'd see that she was living in a new body. Why, yes, she lived within earthly women. And since I felt a glow of her, my heart would get attracted like a magnet where it would open, just in case the Golden Maiden was trying to alert me. And often I would imagine her saying something like,
"Yes, bring your attention here and focus on me."
I knew that some people would judge me, but I would do anything to lead a fellow soul back home. And just as some people learn through books, scripture, religion, traditions, or yoga, love also became a path to guide people through the unknown. It's hard to describe this, because I felt attracted to certain souls like a magnet, and so I tried to show them to the spiritual kingdom upon a path. But as they depart, I'd often have to leave and pave new paths which could leave them perplexed. My spiritual pace made my body and mind move faster and faster, and this cleared karma in a rapid fashion. Many people thought I had gone mad in the earthly world, but I had become an excellent traveler. This rapid traveling and karmic cleansing brought me face to face with all sorts of unbelievable interactions. All sorts of auspicious coincidences would arise, and so we could call this a sort of magic that kept happening that would shock the body and mind. I would bring energy from the kingdom of the spirit, and I would share this with the lover. Then they would experience a great shift in their lives, as if a spiritual path began to take over. This rapid pace attracted abusive ex-boyfriends, while others might expect certain behaviors from me. But I was just trying to open my heart and pave a path into the spiritual kingdom so that all beings could be freed. We were all upon a journey. Meanwhile, I was shifting through a Mercurial life. It became so overwhelming because however I tried to help, it seemed I myself couldn't get this life quite right. Going from the kingdom of the body to the kingdom of the mind, it would leave my spiritual state spinning, and so often I would get lost heading home back to the kingdom of the divine. The kingdoms of Bhakti, Shambala, and the plaid blanket were almost always kind, but now other spiritual groups started to send signs, and it was obvious the journey took a toll on me, because what started as well-intended flags, notes, and mile markers now turned into javelins that began to cause pain as they would pierce me. Since other religious groups were catching on, they would try to copy what the kingdom of Bhakti, Shambala, and the plaid blanket would do. But now some athletes, politicians, comedians, and others would target messages to signal me to show that they were also in on the spiritual scoop. Usually it would come in the form of an ad or clip, and it would be a carefully taken picture showcasing just one eye. Often it would be a post or a message with half of their face, while the other half was cut off from the side. The intuition knew the way, but now beyond the original groups, there were many mysterious people who began to notice. Some would be dying to get my attention, to bring forth their own pursuits into focus. Now the messages they sent were not just mile markers and guidance, but I'd become overwhelmed by how people criticized what I would do. Mind you, this was my interpretation of a psychic aspect of our inner reality, so at times it became difficult to understand what was actually true. On top of that, there were random inner attacks, and I could not tell if this was human or if these were dark forces that would happen to stab me in the back. When I was between the kingdom of spirit and the body or mind, things would break often. And the more I left the spiritual kingdom, the more I'd be thrown into cycles of pain and agony, and there was no telling what would happen. This drove my sensitivity to new heights, as I was always on the lookout for ruin. It was as if whenever I took a step forward, there was a chance I could be overwhelmed by an illusion. The longer I went on, the more illusions became harder to manage. At first, I was well inclined to listen to the teachings of the kingdom of Bhakti, Shambala, and the plaid blanket, but now I was having even more trouble understanding who was actually sending these messages. My mind could twist me into knots, and this could make me feel quite lost. I had to move so quick that my mental and emotional states changed, and I couldn't remember the advice that I'd already forgot. When I was in the kingdom of spirit, the advice was taken with ease, but once I would descend back down to the kingdom of the body or mind, the same advice might trigger my ego, and there it would push me against the ego, where I felt the pressure of a giant squeeze. Depending on the day, I could only take so much, and since this situation was so dire, I knew I had to keep moving, but this also caused me to lose touch. I would say that some of the Christians were quite reluctant to see me, and so when I arrived, it was hard to tell if they welcomed me. All my work was done out of love, but my ego saw certain reactions as cruel. My spirit could be in heaven one night, and then in the morning, I'd be in hell. Some groups were thankful I pointed to the way back home, but it always hurt being on my own. And so sometimes I got angry and upset when they sent their signs, because while they were in the comfortable spiritual kingdoms, I felt abandoned in the wilderness all alone. I began to wonder if the Golden Maiden used me, since she would pull me into situations wherever I might be required. The synchronicities never stopped or settled, and I knew she was using my energy to support, heal, or try to free others. She used my masculine life force as a spark like electrical current, where she'd lead me into a community, group, or company. Then she'd put me right in the middle of a situation or conundrum, and force me to find a way out of it until the new collective would catch on. It seemed I had to sacrifice my reputation and ego, all to attract spiritual attention. There I would direct people to the kingdom of the spirit, while I wrote my experiences and recorded stories, even if not many people were willing to listen. The groups in the kingdom of the body and mind would notice I was quite different. They might say I was odd, or quite an unusual person. And then there were some groups who would toss me out as if I were an alien Martian. Now some days became devastating, because as I would seek the Golden Maiden in the kingdom of the mind and body, it was clear she wanted me to experience the deep aspects of heartbreak. Meanwhile, I tried to do my duty and pave paths to the spiritual kingdom, since there was so much at stake. Just as I began to touch love, I would lead the lover along a spiritual path, and right before we were at peace in the spiritual kingdom, the Golden Maiden would send me back into the wilderness, where I'd go back to the body and mind, clearing paths upon the mission. Through all of this, the teachers and teachings got wind of what I was doing, and they'd help me continue on in the kingdom of the body and mind worlds. But I felt so lonesome and misunderstood that I just wanted to go to my inner garden and silently observe. After enough time on my own, I would find the courage to wander into the physical world. But again, I'd have a longing for the Golden Maiden as I missed her. By traversing rapidly through the kingdoms of the body, mind, and spirit, often I would encounter a lesson or dream and get perplexed by it. It seemed I was in touch with a spark of energy that could help others break through blockades, but it came at a cost of me losing it. Others might rejoice upon spiritual revelations. Others could be terrified. All the while, it took so much energy out of me that I would retreat each night as if I'd lie upon my tomb, where a part of me seemed to pass on and die. Lying alone, I conjured more and more writings to become a master of the mind, body, and spirit. But this mercurial life affected my family, friends, careers, and relationships in such an intense fashion that I was wondering if I should fear this. while others seemed to benefit from interactions with me. Others watched me pass by and held looks of scorn. Some people would feel pity for me as I was called to transform. All the while, I only knew change, since there was never any constant norm. Understand that I did not create these paths. Rather, these pathways to spirit were always here, but sometimes the path was dense, covered by years of abandonment, and so my job was to help clear spiritual paths so that a connection to divinity could be restored. As I was called out into the wild parts of the wilderness, I had to reach the edges of the body and mind, because in my heart, I was led to make sure that the paths were clear so that not a single soul was left behind. The faster I would go on, the more worried some of these groups would become. Oh, there were days I wished I could just sit and study in the pure spiritual kingdoms. The more chaos that happened in the body and mind, the more flaming arrows, swords, and weapons seemed to be hurled towards me in an attack. A lot of the communities in the body and mind didn't seem to care for me. They didn't care that I was trying to clear the paths. Now, while some groups tried to help me, others would throw a flaming arrow to watch me burn. I would suffer in private, where I got a new lesson in which I would learn. The arrows were sharp and extreme, and often it made me far more upset than it would help. But it was clear that my intensity alerted the global community, and this impact began spreading through everyone else. Certain souls would find the writings, and they would be led to the kingdoms of Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, yoga, or whatever it might be called, so that the people could heal. All the while, I didn't take a cent from my work, while I did these writings over and over to prove that God and Spirit was real. I had so many books and chapters to write and record, but this process put so much pressure on me, I cannot put it into words. I got to a point where I found it hard to be around people, and so I mostly enjoyed time around animals. As this creative process occurred, it felt as if my mental and emotional layers endured a couple deaths. Every time I would go into the kingdom of the body and mind, then back to the spiritual realm, it felt like a part of me would be reset. It felt as if people from all over sent messages explaining what I should be doing. They tried to give me directions on how I should be living, but I did everything the best I could, and there was no such thing as living in pure perfection. Since we're all on earth, then we all are living flawed lives. We are somewhere between the teacher's blessings and deep addiction, and it seemed that so many people in the body and mind wanted fierce control of the spiritual wisdom. I trusted very few, still do, and in this spiritual army, there were a few small groups that I could rely upon, and even when I felt wounded from afar, I knew there were a few teachers with true wisdom which I trusted from them. Sometimes a teacher will cut you deep, but this is an ego hurt. Often it was difficult to balance the wounds that came out of kindness, because sometimes random people would fire attacks from their egos, and it would drive me berserk. The great leaders were loving and held the best intentions. Only a handful were my true guides, but there were many individuals who caught wind of what was happening, and so they would scheme to fire arrows aimlessly while attacks rained down from the sky. It must have felt like they were contributing, but it turned into just another vicious attack. And so I would take cover while a barrage of flaming arrows would pierce my spiritual back. As this great spiritual army had grown, it seemed that not a single one of us had successfully completed this journey of life. Meanwhile, the world was addicted to control, and almost all people in the body and mind believed that they alone knew what was right. Now, upon another descent into the kingdom of the body, I stumbled upon a critical moment that would in turn affect me deeply. They call this kairos, or it could be thought of as a synchronicity that could bring two people together. Just at the perfect time, I stumbled upon a meeting of two lovers. I caught a glimpse of the golden maiden in the kingdom of the body, as she had taken the form of a yogini. And at just this critical moment, we crossed paths, where she found me. I had been through so much up till now, and my life was under immense pressure through the barrage of spiritual lessons and attacks. And soon I discovered that this yogini was becoming a best friend, and in her presence, I found peace at last. We became such great friends, and of course feelings started to grow. I'd been pulled into so many kingdoms through the body and mind that these situations where I caught glimpses of the Golden Maiden seemed to be impossible to be known. This yogini was so important to me, and I knew I was special to her, and so we decided that it was only right to date and become partners. Together we mastered the kingdom of the body, and then we entered into the kingdom of the mind. We shared lessons and travel stories. Then before long, she and I took the pathway up into the spiritual kingdom of the divine. I would share spiritual books and wisdom with her, and I would tell her about all the best books. And with her amazing energy, she jumped in and took to it. Then wherever I seemed to be lacking, she taught me things that I needed to be guided in. And so with yoga asana guidance, a total transformation was set to begin between the sharing of our unique wisdom. We prayed before each meal, and everything we did was in an effort to help and to heal. I was led to her by following my intuition, and soon our love turned very surreal. There wasn't a day we wouldn't talk, and we were always thinking about what we would do together. I was falling for her since I knew she was my true lover. Now, when walking upon the spiritual paths, you cannot force someone to walk through, but rather you can clear a path, and maybe they will have the courage to walk beside you. As we walked out of the body and into the mind, we learned so much about each other, and I wanted to stay with her forever. And that's when I heard a psychic message coming from the Golden Maiden, alerting me from afar. But I was shocked, since I thought this was her. It was almost a year that I was with the yogini, and step by step, we walked upon the way where a path was cleared. And so along this path, we encountered many lessons, and we always found love over fear. Meanwhile, the Golden Maiden explained in dreams and visions that we were running out of time. She said I needed to stay true to my commitments, to cage Satan, since there was a wicked force I'd need to confine. But with this yogini before me, my heart space grew bigger than ever before. We'd become very best friends, and now this growing relationship brought us even closer. From the kingdom of the body into the kingdom of the mind, after a long walk together, she took the entire path with me into the kingdom of the divine. Then not a moment later, I was instructed to go back. But this was right as she and I arrived. And so I felt thrown out into the wild lands to fulfill my duties and clear more paths. That's when both of our hearts broke in ways that no words can describe. Of course I was in union with her. She is my best friend. And as I continued on with my duty, the heartbreak wouldn't end. She seemed to be amazed with the kingdom of the divine, and now all the pathways I cleared brought new and exciting teachers and opportunities to her. The same communities that I had cleared pathways for were sending all sorts of teachers that were jumping around to attract her. I love her, and I will always be proud of how she serves, but the heartbreak left a hole within me, and it all started from a feeling of wonder. Sometimes when we share our spark, it can ignite a spark in someone else's life. And while her and I journeyed out of the kingdom of the body and mind, I was left with 3 swords pierced through my heart. I know she was broken too, but she was at home in the kingdom of spirituality. And while she stayed in that blissful space with new and exciting teachers that wowed her, I had to descend into the lonesome journey that could barely be explained. She would go on to travel and find new teachers, sharing stories about gifts and powers that were beyond what I could offer. And so her life seemed to be rising, while mine seemed to descend even lower. I thought about the people who might find the pathways, why I hoped I added value into their lives. But when it came to going through the kingdoms of the body and the mind again, I cannot explain what it feels like to live a mercurial life. Everything comes and everything goes. A great lesson of impermanence, but it is a devastating workload. I was left imagining the spiritual kingdom in awe of the yogini, and so I would offer up prayers because of how great she will succeed. But I felt so low while I risked losing everything. and it appeared that she'd been given even more opportunities. Was this jealousy, or is this more grief and despair? I lost my best friend in a way that I could not bear. It kept tumbling, and the Mercurial Life continually comes together, then falls apart. I would offer loving kindness and send it to the yogini, but night after night, as I tried to rest, I felt the 3 swords piercing my heart. Now the heartbreak is not exclusive to her or to me. This happens to everyone, everywhere, and in every single community. There's a hole in our lives during any heartbreak, and this is not just about me, but this feeling is shared by all when a loving relationship ends, and so we are left with a void of an abyss that feels ever empty. Not something we can hide from, but we must endure. I lost my best friend because I wanted to show her into the kingdom of the spirit, which is now a home to her that is totally pure. And when will this feeling of emptiness end? How can we go on with the world pushing us to the brink? Wars, famine, sickness, and disease. Oh, it seemed this whole planet was condemned. Now after that breakup, I myself had to sober up, and many times it seemed as if the heartbreak would never end. But of course, many spiritual armies kept sending signs and shooting arrows, as if they wanted to point ahead to the way. But I was so destroyed, I didn't know which side was up, because I'd given up just about everything, and all I felt was betrayed that this still wasn't the end. Of course, much of the spiritual army was beyond selfless, and they offered me so much, but after this journey over the last few years, I had finally endured enough. I wondered if these arrows were intended to make my mental and emotional bubble bust. Surely they wanted to pop my ego, but I'd been broken so many times from all sides that what was left of me to explode? I was begging for the attachment and suffering to stop. Oh, please leave me alone. But even after I deleted my social apps, it seemed there were other ways they could access me, and so they'd send me emails day and night from many different senders, and so the thought arose that I should enter into a mental hospital. By some miracle, I made it through, and so I nearly unsubscribed from every email, but still they seemed to fire their arrows and pierce me in ways I never knew I could go through. I alone am not responsible for such a spiritual army, for it has a mind of its own. I would have never guessed any of this was even possible, for until now, this was nothing I could have ever known. And so I heard the Golden Maiden whisper from afar,
Don't bend. Don't water it down. Don't try to make it logical. Don't edit your own soul according to the fashion. Rather, follow your most intense obsessions mercilessly.
I beg you, God and the Goddess, mercy please. Whoever hears this, if you're part of the spiritual army, then I want to thank you for how you came to help set all beings free. I too want to help us become free and save all beings, but let us trust the ways of this world, even in times of despair, for I don't want wars, disease, or famine any more than you, but it is not up to a single person to set all of us free. Let us get back to the heart of the teachings. No more flaming arrows, just loving kindness from here on out, and let us grow accordingly. I want to thank you for how you helped me grow, but I can't take it anymore. I am thankful if you were there to guide me, but there's nothing more I can endure. Thank you for all those who stayed true. I'd do it all over just to get a glimpse of fate, but if I could change one thing, I would never ever leave the yogini alone, for I cannot bear that feeling of heartbreak.